Hi there, Matt Easton of Scholagladiatoria and Eastern Antique Arms. So, historically speaking, one of the problems that swordsmen or people using any kind of weapons, including firearms, in the past faced was rust. And rust, as any of you out there, I'm sure, who keep knives or swords or firearms will know, is a real pain and something that's quite difficult to keep at bay, especially if you live in more humid climates. Obviously, parts of the Far East, even parts of America, can be really challenging to keep rust off your weapons. And I know, for example, in gun cabinets this can be a real issue, or indeed sword cabinets if you have such a thing, and preventing that kind of sort of dewy condensation that leads to rust is a real nightmare. But imagine if you were on campaign, if you were a soldier in any period after the Bronze Age at least, using iron and steel weapons. If you have weapons, be it firearms, swords, knives, whatever, that are made of steel, they're highly susceptible to rust. Now, blades can be protected often in a scabbard, but if you have any steel or iron on the hilt, so pommels, crossguards, handguards, this kind of thing, they're highly susceptible to the weather. Now, imagine you were on a campaign, for example, the Crimean War. You know, the weather wasn't great in the Crimean War. You imagine you're in the cavalry every day. One of the things you're going to have to do is keep your weapons clean. And people who keep rifles and keep other firearms are very used to doing this, but very often people who come into swords or sword collecting don't have a background in firearms, and so they're maybe a little bit this is a bit of a foreign concept to them, the fact that things made of steel and iron have to be continuously cleaned and maintained. Now, obviously you can protect those weapons with forms of grease and oil and wax and things like this, or indeed by covering them, you know, if you're able to wear them in such a way that they're under a coat or a cape or such like, then that's great. However, weapons, especially swords which are sidearms, indeed, you know, like pistols or like knives, they have to be quickly accessible, so you can't pack them away very easily. I suppose you could say the same of rifles as well. You could keep a rifle in a sort of bag, in a case, but then it's useless in that moment of need when you need it instantly. So to cut a long story short, the swords that were carried historically period, doesn't matter whether we're talking about the medieval period or the Victorian period, faced the issue of protecting them from rust both in wear and in storage. Now, in modern times, swords can be nickel plated or chrome plated. Indeed, some of you might say, well, you could make certain parts of stainless steel. That would be true in the modern world. You don't really want to make blades of stainless steel, even in the modern world. There are certain types of stainless steel that are acceptable for knives. However, there's no stainless steels that I'm aware of which make a functional, good sword. They tend to be too brittle. And if you're using carbon steel, clearly that is still, which is still pretty much the best material for making most blades, certainly for swords, debatably for knives as well, and bayonets, then they're going to be susceptible to rust, but you can plate them. And this was what was done, if we look in the sort of World War I, World War II era, you can nickel plate or chrome plate swords and knives and things like this. One of the problems is that does crack and wear off with time. So even swords, for example, from World War I, which were originally nickel plated, you often find they're no longer nickel plated, because all you need is a little scratch in the nickel plating, or chrome plating later on. Nickel plating tends to predate chrome plating. All you need is a little scratch or a knock, and the moisture can get in there, and then it spreads on the iron or steel underneath the plating and lifts the plating off. And this is what tends to happen with antiques, as we find that the plating is all flaked. Now, what happened is in about 1860 or the 1860s, nickel plating started to come in, and by the end of the 19th century, certainly in Britain and in Germany as well, and to a degree France, although France tended to use brass for hilts, so it wasn't so much of a problem, but for scabbards, nickel plating became pretty much standard throughout Europe for certainly for sword scabbards, and to some degree for sword hilts, by the end of the 19th century. But this didn't come in until, as I say, around 1860 or the 1860s. And it didn't become common, I would say, until about the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s. So what did they do before that? Well, here is a sword that dates to the end of the 1840s. It probably dates to about probably about the mid 1840s, about 1845 perhaps, that it maybe a little bit later, maybe about kind of 1848. But it's from the 1840s, and this predates nickel plating. However, what's interesting about it is you can see because it predates that, it's dark. The reason it's dark, and we would call this patina, it's actually what's left over from it having got rusty and then the rust being cleaned off. And when steel gets rusty and then you clean the rust off, you're left with a dark surface, a sort of russet type surface underneath. And this is a superb quality sword. The blade has been more or less protected by the scabbard. But the hilt and the scabbard have been exposed to the elements, and so therefore they've gone dark as a result of having been rusty and then being cleaned. Sometimes steel can also go dark just from handling it, from the grease of our fingers that will make the steel go dark, even though it won't necessarily rust. But what's interesting is this scabbard at a later date, if I flip it over to that side, you can just see there, it's still silvery. Why is that? That is the remainder of later nickel plating that was done. However, they did not do that when the sword was new, because they couldn't do nickel plating in the 1840s. So most swords that date from before 1850 have this kind of surface, unless they've been kept greased and oiled and kept lovingly, most of them have this kind of dark surface because they're exposed to the elements, and that's what happens to them. So there was this period of time where they didn't have nickel plating yet. Chrome plating was far in the future. They didn't have nickel plating yet, so what did they do? Well, the simple answer is think about other things that can protect steel from rust, other metals that don't rust. And one of those is silver. Now silver, obviously in the modern world, we think that, well, that's an expensive metal, that's a precious metal. And it is. And so this was only something that the people with the most money could afford to do, but if they could afford to do it, they did sometimes do it. And what I have here is a recent acquisition actually. It's another Wilkinson sword, and it dates in fact to 1856, so it's only a few years later than this example I showed here, made by the same company as well, but the entire hilt has been silver plated. That is, the backstrap and pommel have been silver plated, the ferrule up there have been silver plated, the grip wire is silver anyway on this pattern of swords, so there's no issue there, but the guard has been silver plated as well, and that has meant that it is still a nice bright shiny colour because it's been protected. Now you can see one of the problems with silver, although it's applied quite thickly to the swords, you can see in areas where it gets damaged. I don't know, I doubt you'll be able to see on this camera unfortunately, but there are some little dark areas where the silver has been chipped or scratched off, and there of course the steel or the iron underneath gets exposed, and that does go dark with age. In this case the blade has been protected by its scabbard, which I still have. The scabbard originally was also silver plated, amazingly, but the silver has rubbed off the scabbard, so the scabbard is now sort of pitted and a normal steel surface, but the blade inside has been protected because it's been protected by the scabbard. So silver plating was a thing for those who could afford it, and in fact it just so happens that because I have quite a lot of swords, here is another example where the silver plating on the scabbard survives, and you can see this is the result of when, if I bring it a bit closer to the camera, when silver plating is looked after and is not chipped away and damaged, you can see it protects the entire surface that it covers. Silver's fantastic, it doesn't perish, it goes dark, it kind of goes a bluey grey colour with patina, but you can just rub that off with a cloth. You can use cleaning products. Obviously the blade inside this scabbard has been protected perfectly because it's in the scabbard. The blade is just a normal steel surface, but in good condition because this sword has been looked after. And you can see that again the back strap and pommel, the guard, and the entire scabbard have been silver plated, so it has survived incredibly well. And one step further than that, I have yet another example here, this one belonging, this also from 1850 1955, I think this one is. So it's late Crimean War, and this one belonged to an officer of the Coldstream Guards, and it's got a relatively unusual blade on it. And this one has also been silver-plated scabbard. It's actually a white metal hilt, so that's another way around the problem of rusting, is to essentially make your hilt of something else. Now I'm a little bit confused actually about what they've made this hilt of. I think it's a sort of nickel alloy, but I'm not 100% sure. It could be that it's just very thickly plated. I can't really tell, but it's not silver. So this is not a silver plated hilt, because it never tarnishes, so it can't be silver. However, the scabbard is silver plated. However, this one, amazingly, they silver plated the blade, which is quite incredible really. So this, obviously being the Coldstream Guards, it was an elite regiment of the Foot Guards. In the Victorian period, if you went into a Foot Guards regiment as an officer, you probably had quite a lot of money, or your family did, and so they have spared no expense on this sword at all. So silver plated blade, silver plated scabbard, and some sort of white metal or plated hilt. I'm not really clear. It's not exactly, I don't think it's silver plated, but we're not really sure. So there we go. In historical periods before modern plating and modern alloys, rust was a major problem. Firearms slightly more tricky, because of course you can't necessarily plate firearms without it just getting rubbed off really quickly, and it doesn't always react well to heat as well, bearing in mind that firearms get hot in use, so plating could lift off and issues like this. So with firearms they tended to blue things, and that's another option you've got, is to blue or brown a surface. Now this doesn't stop rust, so if you look at a gun barrel for example, it's usually a dark colour. The reason for that is because it's heated up to a certain colour, which essentially forms a protective surface, protective layer on the surface of that steel, and it can be taken to blue or brown, usually sometimes blackish if you quench it in oil, and this helps hold back the progress of rust to a degree. However, if you take a gun barrel and leave it outside in the garden, it will get rusty. It will just get rusty more slowly than if it didn't have that blued or blacked surface on it. So that's pretty much one of the cheapest, and you could say hard wearing ways of helping to hold back the progress of rust on a steel surface. But for a sword, if you've got more money and can afford it, before nickel plating came along, they used to silver plate, and indeed sometimes gild as well. Gilding is another thing. So if I just turn to a sword behind me, this sword has a steel hilt, although you can see it looks goldy in colour because the whole hilt has been gilded. Now it just so happens, and you can see a lot of the gilding still on the inside of the guard where it's been rubbed less, it just so happens that this is an infantry officer's sword, and infantry officers were expected to have brass hilts, in other words gold coloured hilts. So they could gild things, so you've got a gold colour, and it's the correct colour to meet regulations. But of course gilding provides a very good protective surface from rust, just as silver does. But if you're in a regiment where your hilt was expected to be silver coloured, for example in the rifle regiment, then silver plating was the way to go. So there we go. And after that, from the 1860s onwards, nickel plating really came in and took over, and nickel plating is a very effective way of having a carbon steel sword, guard, blade, whatever. You can nickel plate the whole lot and it will protect it from rusting, so long as that nickel plating doesn't get chipped or scratched. Cheers folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.